So my topic is Martin Luther, predecessor to Adolf Hitler's final solution, or connecting Martin Luther's words to Adolf Hitler's movement. So my intention is to make the claim that Martin Luther's lesser-known work on the Jews and their lies served as an inspiration to the Third Reich's final solution and other movements against Jewish persons in Germany. I intend to showcase different quotes from the text and tie them into events that occurred during Nazi Germany between 1933 and 1945. And then in the end, I intend to make a correlation between Adolf Hitler and Martin Luther. So who is Martin Luther? Martin Luther was a monk from the 15th and 16th century in Saxony-Anhalt, Germany. He wrote very many famous theological works, but the most famous was the 95 Theses, which were complaints against the Catholic Church and practices of that time. One such practice was the belief of indulgences, which was where if your family member had passed away, you were able to monetarily pay their entry fee to heaven. Martin Luther was extremely against this because he felt that faith and good works, which was a pillar of the Catholic Church in the 15th and 16th centuries, was not true. It was just faith. He also ended up translating the Bible into the medieval German, which before that point had never been done. It had been translated in very small sections, but the entire Bible had never been translated before because it was considered sacrilege for the average person to have a copy of the Bible. It was, in that time period, you were not considered intelligent enough to truly understand what the Lord was saying, and you needed the priest to act as a translator to help you understand. So his movement and his 95 Theses ended up sparking the Protestant Reformation, which was a very huge split between the Catholic Church and Protestant branches such as Calvinism, Anabaptism, Lutheranism. So that was in the 1530s. In the 1543, Martin Luther would write a book called The Jews and Their Lies. This is a picture of the original cover as it would have been distributed. It was a 65,000 word book that was just full of lambasting Jewish persons and their perceived faults. The book has 17 chapters. You can split them into 4 different sections. Section 1 is he talks about how the Jews boast about being related to David and being the chosen people, which he doesn't like and he sees as being against what God would want. And the second section, he cites Bible verses and biblical events as evidence for why the Jews are unworthy and Christians now hold the mantle of God's chosen people. The third section goes into superstitions about the Jews of the time that he sees as complete fact and he thinks is completely right. And the final section is recommended actions regarding the Jews and what good Christians will do. If I had to sum up what his opinion on the Jews are, I would use this next quote. We are at fault in not slaying them. Rather, we allow them to live freely in our midst despite their murdering, cursing, blaspheming, lying, and defaming. We protect and shield their synagogues, houses, lives, and property. In this way, we make them lazy and secure and encourage them to fleece us boldly of our money and goods, as well as to mock and deride us, with a view to finally overcoming us, killing us all for such a great sin, and robbing us all of our property as they daily pray and hope. Now tell me whether they do not have every reason to be the enemies of us accursed goyim, which is a Jewish term for a non-Jew, to curse us and to strive for a final, complete, and eternal ruin. I don't feel that quote needs much explanation. It's quite straightforward. But he's almost saying that the Christian God is punishing Christians for not taking action against the Jews. Because it is not just a pamphlet. In medieval Germany, in medieval Europe, it was considered very traditional to be anti-Semitic. Hatred of the Jews was very common, and a lot of it was based off the fact that according to the Bible, the Jews were led to the death of Jesus. So it was very commonplace for people to hate Jewish persons. However, this is one of the first times you see a call to action. It's not just Jews are terrible people, it's this is what needs to be done, and we are at fault for not doing it. So the Nazis in Germany were very, very fond of Luther. Luther himself is a very big figure in Germany, as I'll get to in a moment. But in 1933, they had a celebration, 2 celebrations. There was an anniversary day, which was on the day that Luther had traditionally nailed the 95 Theses, which is what the coin on the right, I believe, is the the pin on the left is a commemorative pin of the anniversary day from 1933, hosted by the Germans. I don't know if you can see, it's a little foggy, but you can see the cross and the flower, traditional German imagery. And the coin on the right is a coin from the celebration. It was the 450th birthday of Martin Luther. So as you can see, 1483 to 1933. And it was, you put people that you admire and people that you think are good on coins, hence why we have former presidents. Canada, they have the Queen, such like that. So in Germany, as everyone knows, during the Nazis, there was a huge increase of burning books. Joseph Goebbels, one of the SS party leaders, would lead the charge in a very famous night, I believe it was in May, where they burned up to 23,000 books in the Berlin College. And they were burning anybody that was traditionally opposed to German ideals, especially Jewish workers. In fact, they actually burned a couple copies of Helen Keller as well because they felt it was outside of traditional German thought. So it was a burning of anything that was considered against what the German state would want. And Goebbels is famously recorded as saying, "No to decadence and moral corruption, yes to decency and morality in family and state. I consign to the flames the writings of Heinrich Mann, Ernst Glasser, and Erich Kästner." So as you can see, they're burning thousands of books that are not German ideology. And you might be thinking, well, what does this have to do with Martin Luther? Well, Martin Luther, in his 3rd and 11th chapter, would talk about German teachings. In the 3rd chapter, he calls it, "The teachings of the Jew is a venomous basilisk, who poison and kills people merely by fasting." He's laying the groundwork that it's a poisonous thought that needs to be stomped out. In the 11th chapter, which is one of the most famous sections of the book, he actually straightforward says, "Advise that the prayer books and the Talmudic writings in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught be taken away from them." This is compounded by the fact that in that chapter, as I'll show in a minute, he also says burn their schools to the ground and such. So it's not too far of a step to see this and to think perhaps it was an inspiration for mass book burning. In fact, in response to the papal church of the 1500s condemning his writings, he famously burned a lot of the Pope's writings and such. So he's not against burning books, and it's not new to him, the concept of destroying anything that goes against what you think. One of the most famous events before the Holocaust is Kristallnacht, which translates to Night of Broken Glass. It was November 9th, 1938. Hitler Youth members and German citizens began burning synagogues to the ground and looting Jewish stores, and it's estimated that about 100 Jewish people lost their lives in the violence. For a lot of scholars, this event symbolizes a turn where the German state blatantly discriminated against Jewish persons, and it wasn't subdued anymore. You would begin to see the marking of Jew in passports, changing in names and such. This also has its ties to Martin Luther's book. At 2 different sections in chapter 11, he says in the first, to set fire to the synagogues and schools, and to bury and cover them with dirt, whatever will not burn, so that no man will ever again see a stone or cinder of them. And what's interesting is that if you see, in this picture it's not evident, but they burn it to the ground. It's not just shutting down the school. It's not just condemning the building so no one can enter. It is destroying the building and everything it stands for, which echoes of bury it and cover it with dirt. The 6th command he gives a couple commands. He says that usury to take money away from them. The usury be prohibited to them, cash, silver, treasure, he does say the word cash, be taken away from them for safekeeping. And the argument he makes is that their livelihood comes from Christian persons. And this might be a nod to, in the medieval times, Christians were forbidden from money lending. It was considered a dirty work and against the Bible. So Jewish people generally were bankers, loaners, and such like that, hence where the stereotype with Jews and money comes from. And it could be a nod to that. In his logic, Jewish persons get their money from Christians. Therefore, it's not really their money. It's Christian money that they've taken. And you can see they're looting the stores and they're taking the stuff. And so it's vaguely reminiscent. My final point on the correlation, the mass deportation of the Jewish peoples to concentration camps. As you can see in the picture, and everyone knows, the cattle cars that were used to carry Jews from their homes to the concentration camps is, again, something that can be tied to Martin Luther. He says to burn their houses to the ground and to keep them in barns like gypsies and animals. And that it is, he even specifically says, this will bring home to them the fact that they are not masters in our country. They do not have rights. He says again later on that they need to be shown they're not citizens. They're not true Germans. So the fact that he says to treat them like animals, and famously the cattle cars used to transport the Jews, it was inhumane conditions, packed in like animals. So I proposed the question, would Hitler have known Luther's works? Yes, absolutely. As I stated before, the Germans were very familiar with using Luther and celebrating Luther. In fact, I included a very short video. In Germany, in 2017, it was the 500th birthday of Martin Luther, and it was a nationwide celebration. In fact, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel actually deemed it a national holiday. Banks were closed. There was a vast celebration, almost akin to what we would have seen in Nazi Germany in 1933. I couldn't find any really true footage of the 1933 celebration, so using the video, you can see they're standing there and remembering, they're celebrating it like we would almost celebrate the revolution and such. It is considered a very big event in Germany. There were billboards noting the anniversary was coming up and such. I just want to advance the slide. Finally, my final point was, but that doesn't say Hitler himself specifically knew Martin Luther's teachings. Yes, he might know his legacy, and yes, he might know vaguely of him, because Luther, as I said, was famous in Germany and was taught in German schools. It was commonplace to learn about Martin Luther's 95 Theses. But does that mean he would have known his later writings? I propose yes. In Mein Kampf, Hitler's book that he dictated from his prison in 1927, I believe, he talks in his 8th chapter about the marathon runners of history, people, he says, who advanced society to its next evolution. These people, to Hitler, are people that should be emulated and idolized. In fact, at one point, he actually gives an example, and wouldn't you know, we see Martin Luther. To them belong not only the true great statesmen, but all other great reformers as well. Besides Frederick the Great stands Martin Luther, as well as Richard Wagner. What's interesting is, if you do reading on Frederick the Great and Richard Wagner, they are both famously anti-Semitic. Richard Wagner actually wrote his own book about, Richard Wagner, who's a famous German composer, would write his own book about why the Jews were evil. So it's interesting to see that he ties the three together. You have Martin Luther tied in there with two other very famous anti-Semitic people. I feel this is more than enough evidence to show that Hitler drew inspiration from Martin Luther. This was a propaganda poster passed around during the rise of the Nazi Party, and the caption reads, "Hitler's fight and Luther's teachings provide the best defense for German people." Hitler, most definitely, in my opinion, would have taken inspiration from Martin Luther and other such anti-Semitic people. As I've shown, events tie up. Hitler was already quite fond of the teachings of Luther. My only other thing to add would be that I personally would love to study and see what Luther potentially would have thought of the Holocaust and such, but I feel there is really a very open and shut case that Luther inspired him. Thank you.